As I walked down the streets of old Chicago, the moon was rising high and lights aglow. Memories flickered by just like phantoms in the sky of other feet who walked these streets so long ago. As I walked down the streets of old Chicago.
A word about how this talk started. In 1971, I was invited to speak to the members of the Great Lakes Historical Society in Cleveland about the, quote, big fire in October 1871, unquote. It turned out that the program chairman who called me had in mind the lumber camp fires on the western littoral of Lake Michigan in that dry and fateful year. I told the chairman I certainly was no authority on that Holocaust, but that I would be able to tell them what I knew about the Chicago fire. That's the reason I titled my talk The Other Big Fire in 1871, other being Chicago. And believe me, other is in many ways the appropriate word for the Chicago conflagration. In terms of lives lost, human misery, area devastated, and perhaps in property destroyed, the fire that began in Peshtigo, Wisconsin that frightful Sunday evening 108 years ago was the greater of the two. Parenthetically, let me say that there were others too. Holland and Manistee, Michigan, on the eastern shore of the same lake, were also destroyed by fire on October 8th and 9th, 1871. But since I am familiar only with the Chicago fire, I will confine my remarks to that better-known event. Within hours of the Chicago fire, while its embers were still smoking, millions of dollars and trainloads of food and clothing were raised throughout the United States and abroad for the relief of its victims, but scarcely a cent for the poor people of Peshtigo. As an advertising man, I must account for the overwhelming response to the one calamity and none to the other by the fact that Chicago had sold itself to civilized men all over the globe. Chicago also had several nicknames which men remembered: Gem of the Prairie, Windy City, and so forth. Names that excited the imagination and curiosity of men everywhere. Chicago was a well and favorably known product, if you will. It had, to use another term of today, created an image more exciting than that of any other city in post-Civil War America, with the possible exception of New York. Well now, what burned? What was the city like before the fire? Why did it burn? How did it burn? Chicago was many things and different things to different people. It was certainly not the same city for Marshall Field and George Pullman that the people, even the good people, in Conley's Patch knew. But in spite of the great disparity between the city's millionaires and its poor working people, it held out to everyone a golden opportunity. To the rich, the opportunity to become richer. To the poor, the opportunity, or at least the hope, to become self-sufficient, comfortably fixed, or even very well-to-do. On every side there was physical evidence of Chicago's recent growth. Shops, factories, foundries, banks, slaughterhouses, grain elevators, hotels, theaters, restaurants, and saloons rang with the sound of commercial expansion. And if the benefits of all this activity weren't readily available to each of the 334,000 inhabitants of the Gem of the Prairie, they would assuredly be shared by their children. We all know that the geographical location of Chicago at this particular spot in North America was determined by a muddy, sometimes navigable stream that flowed into Lake Michigan. Here's a map of the center of the city of 1871, where most of its 334,000 people lived and worked. Two branches of the river divide the city into three parts, known in the late 19th century as North Division, South Division, and West Division. The river was crossed by 24 bridges, mostly of the bowstring type, like these. The South Division, south of the main branch of the river, was most varied in its commercial and social composition. The northern, or upper part of the South Division contained the city's famous hotels, like the Palmer House. Its great department stores, like Marshall Field and Company. Its theaters, where the best known actors and actresses played regularly. Many of its churches, its banks, local government offices, and its gambling houses. In addition, many of the city's splendid residences, like Terrace Row, shown here, and the lakefront itself, were also part of the South Division. But the character of the southern part of the South Division was vastly different. Here were the cheap saloons, the more disreputable gambling dens, the houses of prostitution, and the hangouts of Chicago's criminals, of which our fair city has always had more than its share. Here's a picture of some of the worst buildings in the South Division, in the part known as Conley's Patch. You can see that they are not much more than kindling. Obviously, any fire that might start near this collection of hovels would be soon out of hand. There were, of course, hundreds of decent but very poor working people in the South Division, and in its farthest reaches there was the vast, mile-square Union stockyards. The North Division was mostly residential. The sections nearer Lake Michigan were occupied by the well-to-do. Here Potter Palmer, Cyrus McCormick, George Pullman, and Joseph Medal, among others, had built their grand homes in settings of sylvan quiet and beauty. Many of these homes were staffed with butlers and retinues of maids and gardeners, and often a servant to milk the family cow. Farther to the west in the North Division were more modest homes, several breweries, and other commercial enterprises. And the North Division did embrace the famous structure that has a great deal to do with our story this evening. In the North Division, near the lake at Chicago Avenue, was the recently completed, thoroughly modern water pumping station and tower. Here's the West Division. It was made up of all that part of the city west of both the north and south branches of the Chicago River, and here is where the action started. The West Division was occupied by the working people of the city. Except for a small area around Union Park, 2 miles from the center of the city, it held out no social pretensions. For the most part, it was comprised of very modest dwellings like this one. Now, for the city as a whole. Overall, there were probably 50,000 buildings of one sort or another in the city. Ever since the founding of Chicago in 1833, it was plagued by scourges of those diseases that are bred by bad water and poor sewage disposal. Cholera and typhoid appeared in recurring epidemics. Following the Civil War, steps were taken to correct some of the conditions responsible for these perils to public health. To improve drainage and reduce flooding, the grade or level of the city streets above the lake was raised 6 to 9 feet. For all practical purposes, this project was completed in the South Division and was well along in the North and West Divisions. It was up to the individual property owners to bring their property up to grade. Here again, the South Division was ahead of the other parts of the city. But the pavement of the raised streets and the construction of sidewalks, as we know them today, lagged behind the new level of the streets. And because not all property owners raised their sidewalks at the same time, or to exactly the same level, many sections of the city had sidewalks that looked like this, which, according to the humor of the time, was the reason all Chicago girls had big feet. In some cases, raised streets simply increased the depth of the mud. This was especially true in the winter and spring. In one instance, a man was seen up to his armpits in mud, and when some people on the nearby sidewalk offered to rescue him, he said, "Never mind, it's all right, I'm on horseback." But in general, the streets and the buildings in the upper half of the South Division were modern by the 19th century standards. Of 534 miles of streets in Chicago, 88 miles were paved. Many of the buildings in the main business section were handsomely designed and regarded as a fireproof construction, like the Drake Block. The fire department was one of the most modern in the nation, although much smaller than needed by a city as large and growing as fast as Chicago. It consisted of 219 men, 17 steam fire engines, 6 hose companies, 4 hook and ladder companies, and 2 hose elevators. They were commanded by a fire marshal and 3 assistant marshals, one for each division of the city. The engines were all similar to this one, and they threw 600 to 900 gallons of water a minute out of the nozzles of their hoses. Let's stop for just a minute and see how a steam fire engine like this compares with one of those big motor-driven engines that we have in Oak Park today. If there should be a fire in this apartment building right now, the Oak Park Fire Desk would send Chief Kelly's men to a 1076 at 1118 Washington Boulevard. 2 engines would respond, one from Lake Street and Euclid Avenue and one from East Avenue and Garfield Street. Each of these motorized apparatus can pump 1,000 gallons of water every minute. So you see the strength of Chicago's horse-drawn pumpers 108 years ago wasn't much behind today's gasoline engines. 108 years ago, each engine's separate 2-wheel horse-drawn hose truck followed it to fires with about 600 feet of hose. There was also a modern fire alarm system in operation almost everywhere. There were 172 numbered alarm boxes. No point in the city was more than a few blocks from a box. By 1871, the older boxes, which were often unreliable, were replaced by modern boxes which any child could activate to telegraph its number to the central alarm office located in the courthouse. Unfortunately, not all the new boxes had been hooked up to a new wiring system, and perhaps the box that figures so fatefully in our story tonight was one of those not properly connected to the central alarm office. When a box was pulled, its number was automatically telegraphed to the central office. There, the same number was telegraphed in turn to all firehouses, and the appropriate companies responded to the location of the box. Supplementing the telegraph system, there was a watchman on duty at all hours in the cupola of the courthouse. When he sighted a fire, he estimated its location and through a voice tube instructed the operator in the central office below him to telegraph the nearest box number to the firefighting companies in their stations. In addition, the same box number was automatically rung on the 11,000-pound bell in the courthouse tower and on several smaller bells throughout the city. But Chicago's fine fire department was given an almost impossible mission. In the 12 months prior to October 1871, it fought an average of 2 fires a day, more than the New York City Department with 3 times the population to look after. In addition, it had to protect a city built mostly of wood, its dwellings either crowded and laced together with wood sidewalks or surrounded with wooden picket fences. True, the department was supported with a modern water supply, but the city's antiquated building regulations were hobbled with politics and sloppily enforced. The city was crossed by 3 branches of a navigable river, but it had no fireboat. And on top of all these invitations to disaster, October 1871 added its own sinister peril. The summer was hot and exceedingly dry. Except for 2.5-inch showers, there had been almost an unbroken drought since July 3rd. The city was a tinderbox, awaiting only the fatal spark. On Saturday night, October 7th, the prelude to destruction was upon Chicago. A planing mill, this is a place where they planed lumber, in the heart of an area insurance men called the Red Flash, took fire. Before firemen reached it, the mill was almost consumed. Its neighbors were lumber yards with a total of 7 million feet of board tenements, coal yards, a railroad yard, and a large grain elevator. The account of the fight put up in this fire is a story in itself. Firemen are usually not given to rhetorical hyperbole, but they called it a perfect hell of heat and smoke. Here's the section of the West Division that this fire consumed before it was put out at 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon. At this fire, the fire department lost 1 hook and ladder, and 1 engine was so badly damaged that it had to be taken to the shop for repairs. Engine 5 suffered slight damage but stayed in service. Since another engine was already in the repair shops, this conflagration left 15 engines on duty on the night Chicago could have used 100. The men were exhausted, some almost blinded from heat and smoke. Many were sent home to rest and recuperate. Together with a police force of 425 men, these then were the guardians of the city and the apparatus at their command that warm October Sunday night. And this was the city before the shrill cry of Mrs. O'Leary brought her neighbors to their doors and windows. This is where Mrs. O'Leary and Patrick, her husband, and their 5 young children lived. It was the rear shanty at 137 DeKoven Street. It was so humble that there was not even a number on the building. But Mrs. O'Leary knew where she lived, and nobody else cared. The O'Learys also owned the cottage in the front of the lot and rented it to Patrick McLaughlin and his family. Back of the O'Learys' dwelling on the alley was Mrs. O'Leary's barn, where she kept her cows and a horse. She ran a milk route in the area. Added to Pat's wages and the rent from the cottage in the front, the income from the milk route made the O'Learys citizens of downright affluence by the standards of the neighborhood. What was going on in the neighborhood between 8:30 and 8:45 on Sunday evening is lost in the smoky history of the fire. Thousands of words of testimony were taken in subsequent investigations. Colorful figures such as Peg Leg Sullivan and neighbors like James Dalton and William Lee figure in the conflicting accounts of those few minutes. It is reasonably certain, however, that Mrs. O'Leary, for one reason or another, went to her barn sometime about 8:45. She carried a lamp, and for some unknown reason, a cow kicked it over. The oil ran on the floor, and the burning wick set the hay on fire. In an instant, the interior was a mass of flame and smoke. Mrs. O'Leary gave a loud scream, which was heard by the neighbors, but at first they paid no attention to it. Patrick O'Leary ran out to see what had happened, and he and his wife tried to save the animals, but without success. By 5 minutes to 9, the fire was visible through the neighborhood. It was seen by a neighbor, William Lee, who ran to Bruno Gall's drugstore at 12th and Canal Streets, where alarm box 296 was mounted on an outside wall. He reached the drugstore at 9:05. Gall took his firebox key, opened the box, and pulled down the lever. This alarm failed to register at the central office at the courthouse. A few minutes later, the fire burst through the roof of the O'Leary barn as if impelled by an explosion. Burning planks, shingles, and masses of burning hay whirled aloft and scattered over the neighborhood. Watchman Joseph Lauf, who had just gone to his post in the tower of the Little Giant Engine Company No. 6 here on Maxwell Street, saw the fire. He called the alarm down to William H. Musham, who was on watch at the desk. Musham turned out the company and hitched up the horses. As the engine broke contact with the station's heater, the steam let go with a roar. The engineer threw his torch into the firebox and touched off the fire under the boiler. The apparatus, with its short-handed crew, rolled out through its doors just as the telegraph sounder was striking 342, 342, Canalport Avenue and Halsted Street. Musham paid no attention to this telegraphed alarm, but went directly to the fire that Lauf had spotted from the tower of the firehouse. The Little Giant hooked up to the hydrant at the southwest corner of DeKoven and Jefferson Streets and went to work. Now, just a moment before Watchman Lauf spotted the O'Leary's fire, William Brown, night operator in the Central Fire Alarm Office in the courthouse, noticed a light in the southwest. He thought at first it was simply the flare-up of coal piles at the site of the Saturday night fire. At the same time, Watchman Matthias Schaefer in the cupola of the courthouse spotted the O'Leary fire. Through his telescope, he fixed its location as Canalport Avenue and Halsted Street, and he called down to Brown to strike box 342. This was a very serious error, the first of many that evening. At 9:21, the bells in the engine houses throughout the fire department were sounding the alarm, and the courthouse bell boomed out 342, 342 over the quiet city. At 9:22, another excited neighbor ran into Gall's drugstore, and Gall again pulled box 296. This alarm also failed to register at the alarm office. In response to the alarm for box 342, several pieces of firefighting equipment raced around the O'Leary fire and went to a point more than a mile away from it. Engine 6 was left to fight the fire alone for the next 10 to 15 minutes. Engine Company 5, however, on receiving the alarm for the wrong box, did, after a false start, get to the O'Leary fire, coming in from the west on Fourguer Street. Unfortunately, you will recall, Engine 5 had been damaged at the Saturday fire, and as soon as it started to pump water, its hose broke. All this time, the men of Engine 6 were playing a heavy stream on the O'Leary fire, and for a while they seemed to have won, but the heat caused the barns and the houses across the alley on the south side of Taylor Street to ignite, and the company suddenly found themselves surrounded by flames. Finally, At about 9:40, 40 minutes after Mrs. O'Leary let out her first scream, the companies that had gone to the wrong location were all at work at the spreading O'Leary fire. But by then the homes on the north side of Taylor Street were burning, and the wind, gentle as it was, carried burning boards to the northeast. About 10 p.m., a burning plank 2 feet long sailed through the air and struck the steeple of St. Paul's Church. It was almost immediately enveloped in flames. Watchman Schaefer saw this fire too, but again he missed. He had Box 387 transmitted, 3 blocks north and 1 block east of the burning church. From the church, the fire quickly spread to a shingle mill and furniture factory in the same block. At 11:30 p.m., the fire reached Van Buren Street. By now, it was awe-inspiring spectacle. Flames soared high, driving tremendous billows of smoke to the northeast. The sky was filled with showers of sparks. The roof of the water intake crib, 2 miles out in the lake, caught fire. Then suddenly, a red glare sprang up in the South Division. The Parmalee Omnibus Company had just completed construction of a 3-story stable at Jackson and Franklin Streets and filled it with hay for its first day of business, Monday, October 9th. Next, the gas works went up, although there was never any explosion here because the superintendent opened valves and sent 200,000 cubic feet of gas to holders in the North Division. At 1:30 Monday morning, the courthouse itself was set afire by a timber blown from LaSalle Street. Brown and Schaefer set the machinery so that the bell in the tower boomed its dirge until the tower collapsed into the inferno below it. As they left the building, the fire alarm operators told the jailer in the basement to release all his prisoners, which he did. From now on, all accounts of the fire are repetitious. The fire advanced in 4 separate streams to the North Division. It defied the most ingenious schemes and most heroic efforts to save buildings and their contents. It devoured one important, quote, fireproof, unquote, structure after another. In the whole part of the city swept by the fire, fewer than a half-dozen property owners successfully defended their buildings. Even historical societies are not immune. Here's the ruin of the Chicago Society's first building. The fire department fought the Holocaust courageously. Firemen frequently had to run for their lives as buildings behind them or on their flanks suddenly burst into flames from inducted heat or burning brands that entered through windows broken by heat. Here are the 4 main thrusts of the fire from the South Division across the main branch of the river into the North Division. Ahead of these all-consuming flames fled terrified humanity. Rich and poor alike, some in carriages and wagons, but most on foot. Businessmen with their records, bankers with money, jewelers with jewelry, householders with oddly selected possessions, children with toys and dolls. Those who owned or could hire wagons fled with the furnishings of their homes, in many cases only to have them burned or stolen on their way to some place they thought safe. They fled across burning bridges and through the 2 crowded tunnels under the river. Doctors, nurses, and patients alike fled from the burning Marine Hospital located at what is now Wacker Drive and Michigan Avenue. Some took refuge in Lake Michigan, where they stayed until it was all over. But if there was ever any hope of saving that part of the city ahead of the columns of fire, it was dashed by a single burning timber 12 feet long that struck the northeast corner of the water pumping station and lodged against one of the false turrets. From this brand, the roof caught fire, and soon the interior was a raging furnace. At 3:30 Monday morning, the men on duty in the waterworks drew the fires from the boilers, raised and tied the safety valves, and fled for their lives. I don't have to tell you what that meant. Chicago, or all that remained of it, was without water. It was now wholly at the mercy of the onrushing flames. The 14 remaining engines and their brave crews were out of action. There was no more they could do to fight the flames, except in a few scattered areas where they could pump from the river or lake. After burning the Rush Street Bridge and the ships near the mouth of the river, and setting grain elevator A on the south bank of the river ablaze. The fire moved slowly south, consuming what remained of the main business district. Here is State and Madison Streets, the world's busiest corner. At 9 Monday morning, the fire struck the new Palmer House. Then it destroyed McVickers Theater and the Tribune Building. It went all the way south on Michigan Avenue. It consumed the elegant terrace row at Congress Street, which you saw earlier, and then joined up with the Parmelee fire that was still moving east. Here it stopped, partly due to the fact that 4 engines had linked up their pumping power from the lake to the next engine in line and fought the fire to a standstill in the neighborhood of Harrison and Griswold Streets. The fire, so far as the South Division was concerned, was out. At 5 p.m. Monday, the Chicago Avenue Bridge burned, trapping hundreds of people crowded at its east end and now surrounded by fire. The greatest number of bodies found in one location were found here. The fire continued its unchecked progress until it reached the city limits at Fullerton Avenue, almost 5 miles north of Mrs. O'Leary's cottage. The average width of the burned area was 1 mile. At 11 p.m., the light rain, which had been predicted by the Weather Bureau on its Sunday forecast, started to fall. At 4 a.m. Tuesday morning, the fire was out, 31 hours after it started. Most of the once proud, busy, booming city was a scene of heartbreaking desolation. Here and there a wall told what edifices had once stood on its site, but most of the ruins were unrecognizable. So intense was the heat that steel, iron, glass, and limestone melted and ran like butter. In the South Division, the 5-story Lind block at the river in Randolph Street and a small unfinished building were saved. The handsome Lind block stood until 1963, when it was demolished to make room for an extraordinarily ugly 30-story structure. In the North Division, a 2-story building and the Ogden Mansion set in a large park and the modest home of police officer Bellinger were saved by their owners. The Bellinger building still stands in excellent condition. In the West Division, several scattered houses and buildings, and you've guessed it, Mrs. O'Leary's humble and now historic home, were spared. The aftermath of the catastrophe was almost as sensational as the fiery event, but I think you've had enough. About 250 people lost their lives. 17,450 houses that stood on 2,124 acres were destroyed. General Phil Sheridan called in 10 companies of the regular army. 7 state troops were on duty, and 18 companies of volunteers helped patrol the ruined city. In general, all this military show performed well, but it ended in tragedy when a college boy volunteer challenged and then shot and killed a prominent citizen and Civil War veteran. All the troops left the next day. The total financial loss was put at $200 million. Insurance claims of $50 million were paid. Of 250 insurance companies doing business in the city, 70 failed completely. Almost $5 million was contributed to the relief fund, $1 million from foreign countries. What did the gentry of Oak Park contribute? I don't know. Doubtless the 200 people who lived in Kettle Springs Grove helped out as people around the world did. Several refugees were sheltered in the village. Several Oak Park businessmen suffered great damage and loss in their Chicago properties. But the fire was a boon to the town. Between 1870 and 1872, its population doubled to 400. And, in 1872, the name of the grove was officially changed to Oak Park. In the ensuing investigations, as might be expected, Mrs. O'Leary came in for long and generally unfriendly questioning. The press of the day treated her cruelly, often portraying her as a crude old hag. Her race and religion accounted for some of the animosity because, you will remember, the vestiges of the anti-foreigner, anti-Catholic, know-nothing party still contaminated American life. Here's a typical cartoon. Actually, Kate O'Leary was a healthy, normal woman, about 35 at the time, probably, like a very large part of the 40 million people who emigrated from the British Isles in the 19th century, in some respects illiterate. She was an intelligent and good neighbor, although thoroughly frightened by the role into which a frisky cow had thrust her. As a transplanted New Yorker, I can't see that Chicago is a better city than it was in 1871. It now has almost 3.5 million people and property with an assessed valuation of $13 billion. It's still the rail center of the nation. It's the air center and near the top in waterborne traffic. It still has a great fire department with a tradition of devoted service that it upholds like no other department of the city. And for some reason, some monstrous fires. The city is bigger, yes, but better, that's debatable. Certainly it's taller. Chicago builds the highest skyscrapers in the world. Here's a good example, Big John. It's 5 times as tall as the historic Water Tower. Before the ashes of the 71 had cooled, John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a long, typical 19th century poem. 8 lines of it are, "Men said at vespers, all is well. In one wild night the city fell. Fell shrines of prayer and marts of gain before the fiery hurricane. On 70 spires had sunset shone where ghastly sunrise looked on none. Men clasped each other's hands and said, the city of the West is dead. Dead indeed. Almost 3.5 million people buying and selling $25 billion worth of goods and services a year. Just shows you how wrong a Massachusetts poet can be.
Way up in the northward, upon the borderline, a great commercial city, Chicago, you will find. Her men are all like Abelard, her women like Heloise. All honest, virtuous people, 'cause they come from Illinois. So move your family westward, bring all your girls and boys, and rise to wealth and honor in the state of Illinois. So move your family westward, good health you will enjoy, and cross the Shawnee Ferry to the state of Illinois.